Welcome back. Close the lights. Get comfortable. And whatever you do, don't go into the woods tonight. There is something out there. Something that has been out there for a very long time. Something that leaves footprints the size of dinner plates pressed deep into the mud. Something that snaps trees like toothpicks and screams into the dark with a voice that doesn't sound like any animal any biologist has ever catalogued. Something that has been seen by thousands of people across centuries, on nearly every continent, in nearly every culture, and yet the moment anyone gets close enough to truly understand what it is, it disappears. Like smoke. Like a nightmare the moment you open your eyes. Tonight, we are going to talk about 6 encounters. 6 moments when ordinary people just like you, stepped outside their comfort zones, into the trees, into the dark, into the wilderness, and came face to face with something that shattered every assumption they had about the world and about what shares this planet with us. So lean in. Keep the lights low. And let's begin. The first story comes from the Pacific Northwest, from the dense and ancient forests of Oregon, deep in the Cascade Mountains, where the trees are so tall and so thick that in some places, sunlight never touches the ground. This is old forest. This is the kind of forest that existed before human beings had words for anything. And in these woods, in the autumn of 2014, a man named Craddock Henley had the kind of encounter that would leave him unable to sleep without medication for the next 2 years. Craddock was not the type to believe in anything he couldn't touch. He was 43 years old, worked as a geological surveyor, had spent most of his adult life outdoors in remote terrain, and considered himself precisely the kind of man who was too experienced and too rational to be frightened by shadows or strange noises. He had hiked the Cascades dozens of times. He knew the sounds of coyotes, elk, black bears, mountain lions. He knew the difference between wind movement and animal movement in the brush. He knew what belonged in the forest and what didn't. What he encountered in October of 2014 did not belong. He had set up camp at roughly 4,000 feet elevation, just off a trail that most hikers avoided because of its steep and uneven terrain. He liked the solitude. He liked being somewhere that took effort to reach, somewhere that filtered out the casual visitors and left only the serious wilderness behind. He had a small fire, a single-person tent, and a routine he had followed hundreds of times before. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary silence of a quiet night in the forest. This was different. This was the kind of silence that animals make when something predatory and large is moving through their territory. Every bird, every insect, every small rustle of nocturnal life simply stopped. And Craddock, who understood animal behavior, felt the first cold thread of unease slide through him. Because that kind of silence means something big is nearby. And in those mountains, big usually means bear. He reached for his bear spray and his flashlight. Standard procedure. He sat very still and listened. Then he smelled it. People who have had these encounters almost universally describe a smell that precedes the visual. It is described consistently by people who have never spoken to each other, across different countries, across different decades. A smell of sulfur and wet fur and something underneath those things that is almost like rotting vegetation mixed with a kind of musk that has no human equivalent. It is a smell that bypasses the rational mind entirely and goes straight to the oldest, deepest part of the brain, the part that existed before language, the part that still knows, on a cellular level, what it means to be prey. Craddock smelled it, and his body reacted before his mind did. He was on his feet, flashlight raised, before he even consciously understood why. The beam swept across the tree-line. And there, at the edge of the light, standing between 2 massive Douglas firs, was something that stood upright on 2 legs and was at minimum 8 feet tall. He told interviewers later that his first desperate thought was that it was a man in a suit. Because that is what the rational mind does. It tries to normalize the impossible. It tries to fit what it is seeing into a category that doesn't require the complete restructuring of your understanding of the world. It was a man in a suit. It had to be. Except no man in a suit would be that tall. No man in a suit would stand with that kind of absolute stillness. No man in a suit would have eyes that caught the flashlight beam and reflected it back with a dull amber glow. Animal eyeshine. Not human. Not a suit. Something alive. It stood there for what Craddock estimated was about 45 seconds, though he said later that time had stopped meaning anything in a normal way. It watched him. He watched it. And then, without any sudden movement, without any sound, it simply turned and walked back into the trees. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that Craddock could feel vibrating slightly through the ground beneath his boots. And then it was gone. He did not sleep that night. He broke camp before dawn and hiked out by headlamp. And when he got back to his truck and sat behind the wheel, he started shaking and could not stop for almost an hour. What makes Craddock's account compelling is not just the encounter itself. It's what he found the next morning before he left. He had gone to check the perimeter of his camp in the early gray light, telling himself he was being irrational, telling himself he needed to confirm that what he had seen was something explainable. And there, at the edge of the tree-line where the thing had been standing, he found footprints, pressed into the soft earth of the forest floor, deep enough that they had to have been made by something of enormous weight. 17 inches long. 5 toes, all clearly articulated. No claw marks, which immediately rules out any known bear species, because bears have claws and their prints show them. These prints had no claws. They were flat-footed, bipedal, and enormous. He photographed them. He sent the photographs to the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, one of the most established groups that documents these encounters in North America. Their researchers confirmed that the stride length between prints was consistent with a bipedal creature between 7 and 9 feet tall. The depth of the impression suggested a weight of somewhere between 500 and 800 pounds. The first story takes place in the lake country of northern Minnesota, in a region locals refer to simply as the Boundary. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness is one of the most staggeringly beautiful and genuinely isolated stretches of natural landscape in the entire United States. It covers over 1 million acres. It contains more than 1,000 lakes. And it sits right on the border between the United States and Canada, which means that in many parts of it, you are not just remote from civilization. You are remote from jurisdiction. You exist in a kind of geographic no-man's land where the rules that govern ordinary life become suggestions rather than certainties. People who work in the Boundary Waters talk about it with a reverence that edges toward unease. The trees are old there. The lakes are deep. And some of the cabins that dot the shorelines have been standing since before your grandparents were born, weathered and warped by decades of brutal winters and sweltering summers, their logs dark with moisture, their foundations slowly sinking into the earth as if the ground itself is trying to pull them under. In October of 2019, a man named Corvus Hale drove a rented SUV 9 hours north from Minneapolis with 2 things in mind: finishing the architectural thesis he had been procrastinating on for 3 semesters, and disappearing from a life that had recently fallen apart in every conceivable way. His girlfriend had left him. His academic advisor had given him a final extension. His apartment lease had expired, and rather than renewing it, he had loaded his laptop, his books, his sleeping bag, and a week's worth of canned food into the back of that SUV and driven north until the radio stopped working. He found the cabin through an online rental listing that described it as a writer's retreat with lakefront access, no Wi-Fi, fully stocked kitchen, fireplace. He paid for 7 nights. He told no one exactly where he was going. The cabin was everything the listing promised and nothing it had prepared him for. It sat on the southern bank of a lake called Harrow Lake, a name that does not appear on most commercial maps, only on the older topographical surveys used by the U.S. Forest Service. The structure itself was genuine log construction, probably dating to the 1940s, with a covered porch that faced the water and a woodshed attached to the side. Inside, the kitchen was serviceable, the fireplace worked, and the main bedroom had a window that looked directly out over the lake. Corvus described the first 2 days as close to perfect. He woke up early, made coffee on the gas stove, sat on the porch with his laptop, and worked. The lake was motionless in the mornings, like hammered pewter, and the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the occasional cry of a loon somewhere out in the middle of the water. On the third night, he heard the first knock. It came at 2:17 in the morning. He knew the exact time because he had been awake, which was unusual, lying in the dark with that particular kind of insomnia that feels less like sleeplessness and more like a warning from your own body that something is not right. The knock was slow and deliberate, not frantic, not accidental. It was 3 knocks, evenly spaced, like someone who had learned the rhythm of a polite social call and was executing it with mechanical precision. He lay perfectly still. His first thought was that it was the wind. His second thought was that the wind does not knock 3 times. He got up, took the flashlight from the nightstand, and went to the front door. He opened it. Nothing. The porch was empty. The lake stretched out ahead of him, perfectly black, perfectly still. The trees on the far shore were dark silhouettes against a sky thick with stars. He stood there for a full 2 minutes, listening, before going back to bed. He told himself it was a branch. He told himself the old structure settled and made odd sounds. He slept. The next morning, he found the first mark. It was on the exterior wall of the cabin, at about chest height on the log just to the left of the front door. It was a long horizontal scratch, deep enough that it had gone through the weathered gray surface wood and into the pale wood beneath, leaving a line of fresh exposed grain that was shocking in its whiteness against the dark old logs. It was approximately 18 inches long, perfectly straight, as if made with a ruler. He photographed it on his phone and moved on, telling himself it was an old mark he had simply not noticed before. That night, the knock came again. Same time. 2:17. Same pattern. 3 deliberate, evenly spaced knocks. This time he was ready. He had his flashlight in his hand before the third knock finished, and he was at the door within seconds. He threw it open. A figure was walking away from the porch. It was moving toward the tree line that bordered the north side of the cabin, moving with a slow, unhurried gait, and even in the pale light of the stars and the thin beam of his flashlight, he could see that it was tall, far taller than any person he had ever encountered, dressed in what appeared to be dark clothing that was formless and heavy, hanging off its frame like wet cloth. He shouted. He shouted hello, he shouted stop, he shouted hey, because in moments of genuine shock the human brain produces the most ordinary words. The figure did not stop. It did not acknowledge him. It walked to the tree line, which was perhaps 40 yards from the cabin, and then it simply was no longer there. Not hidden. Not disappeared behind a tree. Simply gone, as if it had never been. Corvus Hale did not sleep again that night. He built a fire, sat in the main room with every light in the cabin on, and waited for dawn with his back pressed against the wall furthest from the front door. When light finally came, he went outside again and examined the tree line. There was nothing there. No footprints. No broken branches. No evidence that anything had walked through that wet, leaf-covered ground. And this is the detail that he returned to again and again when he later described the experience, the detail that produced in him the most profound and lasting fear. Not the figure, not the knocking, the absence of footprints, because it had rained the day before. The ground at the tree line was soft and saturated. A deer walking through it would have left clear impressions. A person would have left deep, unambiguous tracks. But there was nothing. The ground was pristine, undisturbed, as if the figure had been there without weight, as if it had existed without touching the earth. He packed his things and drove back to Minneapolis that morning, and he never returned to Harrow Lake. But the story does not end there, because approximately 6 months later, doing research for reasons he cannot fully explain even to himself, Corvus discovered that the cabin he had rented had been the site of a disappearance in 1987. A retired schoolteacher named Etta Pryor had rented it for a month-long painting retreat in September of that year and had vanished without trace on the 14th day of her stay. Her car was still in the driveway. Her painting supplies were still set up on the porch. Her final canvas, still wet, showed a figure standing at the tree line of Harrow Lake. Tall, formless, dark, looking toward the cabin. The canvas is still in the possession of the Minnesota Historical Society. Etta Pryor was never found. Now I want you to ask yourself this question, and I want you to take it seriously. When you look at a place, a building, a landscape, and it gives you a feeling that something is not right even though you cannot identify what it is, do you listen to that feeling? Do you act on it? Or do you tell yourself it is just your imagination and stay anyway? Because Corvus Hale told himself it was his imagination for 4 days. And Etta Pryor presumably did the same. What is that feeling actually telling you? And what does it cost when you ignore it? There is a theory, and I want to be very clear that this is speculative, held by certain researchers who study what they call place memory, the idea that locations, particularly old ones, can accumulate the emotional residue of events that have occurred within them, that traumatic or violent events leave something behind in the physical environment, some kind of echo that sensitive individuals can perceive. It sounds like science fiction. But consider this. Multiple independent visitors to Harrow Lake over the years have reported the same sensation. Not similar. The same. The feeling of being watched from the tree line. The sound of 3 knocks in the night. And always, at precisely 2:17 in the morning. No one has yet found a satisfying explanation for why that particular time repeats. And honestly, I am not sure I want one. The second story moves us south and east, to the Ozark Mountains of northern Arkansas, where the landscape is ancient in a way that feels almost confrontational. The Ozarks are not like other mountain ranges. They are not the Rockies with their dramatic vertical peaks or the Appalachians with their rolling blue ridges. The Ozarks are old in the way that things are old when they have outlasted everything that tried to define them. They are a plateau, technically, worn down by millions of years of erosion into something that looks like mountains but is actually the remnant of what used to be much higher and much more vast. The lakes there are largely man-made, created in the mid-20th century when the Army Corps of Engineers dammed the White River and its tributaries, flooding entire valleys, entire towns, entire cemeteries, and creating enormous reservoirs that are beautiful on the surface and deeply strange below it. Locals know that when the water is clear and the sun is at a certain angle, you can sometimes see the shapes of old buildings beneath the surface. Roof lines. Streets. The ghosts of places that used to exist and were simply drowned to create a recreational asset for people who would never know they were boating over a cemetery. The Lakehouse in this story sits on the shore of Beaver Lake, a reservoir created in 1966 that covers approximately 28,000 acres of what used to be farmland, small community settlements, and forest in Carroll County, Arkansas. The specific property, which we will not name precisely for reasons that will become apparent, was built in the mid-1970s on a bluff overlooking the lake and has been in rental service for most of its existence. It is a handsome structure by local standards, 3 bedrooms, a wraparound deck, a dock that extends 60 feet out over the water. The listing describes it as peaceful, family-friendly, and perfect for creating memories. And for most of the people who rent it, that is exactly what it is. But there is a particular period in 2021 that changed how at least one family thinks about water, about old places, and about the things that might survive beneath the surface of what was drowned. The Vance Kessler family, Theodora Vance and her husband Ozra Kessler and their 2 children, a 12-year-old boy named Florian and a 9-year-old girl named Wren, arrived at the Beaver Lake property on a Thursday in late July. Theodora was a high school history teacher on summer break. Osric was a civil engineer who had taken 2 weeks of vacation. They had rented the property specifically because it was isolated enough to feel like a genuine escape, but close enough to the small town of Eureka Springs that they could reach civilization in about 40 minutes if they needed to. They had considered it a sensible balance between adventure and comfort. They had not considered it enough. The first 3 days were everything a summer vacation should be. They kayaked. They barbecued on the deck. Florian and Wren played in the water off the dock until sunset. The nights were warm and loud with insects and the distant sound of the lake lapping against the dock pilings. Theodora read novels. Osric fixed 2 things around the house that he found broken, because he was that kind of person, and felt genuinely relaxed for the first time in years. On Sunday evening, the 4th day, Wren said something at dinner that changed the entire texture of the trip. She said, in the matter-of-fact way that children report things that adults tend to dismiss because adults have forgotten how seriously children process the world around them, "There is a lady in the water. She has been watching the house." Theodora and Osric exchanged the look that parents exchange. The gentle, diplomatic look that says we will address this calmly and rationally. Osric asked Wren to describe the lady. Wren said she was very pale and wore a dark dress, and she was standing in the water up to her waist and looking at the house. Wren said she had seen her twice, once in the morning when she was on the dock, and once in the evening from her bedroom window. Wren said the lady never moved. She just stood there, looking. Osric and Theodora went down to the dock after dinner and examined the water. There was nothing. No one. The lake stretched out in every direction, absolutely empty. They told Wren she had probably seen a heron. They told her that herons stand in the water exactly like that, still and pale, watching. Wren looked at them with that patient, slightly disappointed expression that children adopt when they understand that they are being handled rather than heard, and she said, "Herons don't have faces like that." And she did not bring it up again. 2 nights later, Theodora woke at approximately 3 in the morning to the sound of something on the dock. It was a rhythmic sound, slow and repetitive, like weight being shifted from foot to foot on the wooden planks. She lay still and listened for several minutes. She told herself it was a raccoon or a duck or something mundane and nocturnal that had no interest in her family. Then she heard the sound of the dock door, the small gate at the dock's end that prevented children from accidentally running off the edge, being opened. The latch on that gate had a distinctive metallic click. She had heard it dozens of times over the week. This was that click, unmistakable, and then the sound of the gate swinging on its hinges. She woke Osric. He took a flashlight and went downstairs and out onto the deck. He shone the flashlight down at the dock and saw nothing. He walked down to the dock and examined it from end to end. The gate at the end was closed and latched. Nothing had been on the dock. He came back to bed, and they lay awake for a long time without speaking. The following morning, Florian was the first one up, and when he came downstairs he found something on the kitchen table that had not been there the night before. It was a small object, roughly cylindrical, approximately 3 inches long, made of some kind of dark, water-damaged wood that crumbled slightly at the edges. It appeared to be a child's toy, very old, hand-carved, the kind of crude but recognizable figure that a parent or grandparent might have whittled for a child decades ago. It was wet. Not damp. Wet. There was a small puddle of water on the kitchen table beneath it, as if it had been brought out of the lake very recently. Theodora photographed it, and later sent the photographs to a colleague who specialized in material culture and historical artifacts. Her colleague's response was measured but significant. Based on the photographs, she believed the object dated to the 1940s or possibly earlier. She noted that the wood appeared to be cedar, which is resistant to rot and could survive long periods of submersion. She noted that the carved figure appeared to be female, in a dress. And she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, something that Theodora had not known and that I want you to understand the full weight of right now. When the Army Corps of Engineers flooded the valley to create Beaver Lake in 1966, they did not relocate everything they were supposed to relocate. Historical records show that at least 3 small community cemeteries were supposed to be fully excavated and the remains moved before the reservoir filled. Documentation from that period suggests that due to budget constraints and scheduling overruns, this was not completely accomplished. There are bodies beneath Beaver Lake. Not just foundations and streets and the architectural bones of drowned communities. There are people down there, people who were buried in those hills before the water came, people who were promised that their resting places would be respected and then left there when the economics made it inconvenient to keep that promise. I need you to sit with that for a moment. Those are real lakes that real families rent vacation homes on. Those are real bodies of real water above real graves. And those graves are flooded. And whatever that means for the ground and for the things in it, whatever that means in whatever framework you use to understand the world, I think we can all agree that it is a profound violation of something. Think about this question now. If you discovered that the beautiful, peaceful lake you were vacationing on was directly above a drowned and largely unexcavated cemetery, would that change how you felt about it? Would it change what you thought was in the water? Would it change how you felt about the thing your 9-year-old daughter said she saw standing in the water looking at the house? The Vance Kessler family left the following day. They forfeited the final 4 days of their rental. They have not returned to Beaver Lake. Wren has not spoken about the lady in the water since. But Theodora told her colleague something in a subsequent message that I find genuinely chilling, and I am going to tell it to you exactly as it was reported. She said that on the morning they left, when she was loading the last of their bags into the car, she looked back at the house for a moment, the way you always do when you leave a place, that involuntary backward glance. And she saw Wren standing on the upstairs deck, looking down at the lake. And Wren was waving. Not at her parents. Not at anyone visible. She was waving at the lake. And then she turned around and went back inside without explaining why, and she has never explained it since. The toy is in a box in their garage. Theodora cannot bring herself to throw it away, and she cannot bring herself to research it further, because she has decided, quite consciously, that there are answers she does not want to have. The third story is different from the first two in a fundamental way. The first two stories involve things seen and heard and felt but never fully confirmed, the kind of experiences that leave room for doubt if you are determined to find it. The third story does not leave room for doubt, because unlike the first two, it has a witness. And unlike most witnesses in these kinds of stories, this witness is a retired law enforcement professional with 32 years of service to a county sheriff's department in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a person whose entire career was built on observation, documentation, and the disciplined rejection of speculation in favor of evidence. His name is Arndt Calloway, and what he experienced at his own family's Lakehouse over the course of a single weekend in November of 2018 constitutes one of the most methodically documented and deeply disturbing first-person accounts I have encountered in 2 years of research into remote location incidents. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan is another one of those places that needs to be understood before the story can be properly told. The Up, as locals call it, is separated from the rest of Michigan by the Straits of Mackinac, a fact that gives it a physical isolation that mirrors its cultural one. It is enormous, about 16,000 square miles, and sparsely populated, fewer than 300,000 people across all that land. In November, after the hunting season winds down and before the snowmobiling season begins, large portions of it become effectively empty. The summer residents lock up their cabins and go south. The seasonal workers who serve them disappear. And what is left is the Upper Peninsula in its true form, a vast, frozen, essentially featureless landscape of pine forest, bog, and lake where the sun goes down before 5 o'clock and the silence is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat. Arndt Calloway's family had owned a lake house on the shore of a lake called Morrill Pond, which is not a pond despite its name but a lake of about 340 acres, since 1971. His parents had bought it as a young couple. He had grown up spending summers and occasional holidays there. He knew it the way you know a place that has been part of your entire life, intimately and without mystery. He knew which steps on the porch creaked. He knew that the furnace made a sound like a cough when it first started up. He knew that the tree line on the east side of the property was where the deer came in the early morning, and he knew that the ice on Morrill Pond came in by mid-December and stayed until April. He had been going there for 47 years. He knew that place. and he knew that something was wrong within 4 hours of arriving for what was supposed to be a quiet solo weekend of late-season fishing. He arrived on Friday afternoon, the 2nd of November. He described the drive-in as normal, the property as it should be for that time of year, the house cold but intact. He turned on the furnace, which coughed as expected, unloaded his truck, and made dinner. He sat on the enclosed porch with a beer and watched the lake in the last light of the day. The lake was gunmetal gray. The sky was low and the color of old snow. The tree line on the far shore was black against it. Normal. All of it exactly as it should be. At 7:45 in the evening, the dog started barking. Arndt had brought his dog with him, a 9-year-old Labrador retriever named Burke, a calm, experienced outdoors animal that had been coming to this property for 7 of his 9 years and had never demonstrated fear of anything the property contained. Burke began barking at the back door of the house, the door that opened onto the dock and the lake, with an intensity and a register that Arndt described as unlike anything he had ever heard from the dog in 9 years. Not excitement, not aggression. He used the word terror. He said it was the sound of an animal in terror. Arndt went to the back door and looked out. The dock was empty. The lake was dark. He opened the door and Burke, who had never in his life refused to go outside, pressed himself against the back of Arndt's legs and would not cross the threshold. Arndt stepped out onto the dock alone and walked to the end of it. He stood there for a few minutes in the cold dark, listening. The lake was quiet. No wind. No movement. He went back inside, and Burke remained agitated for the rest of the evening, following Arndt from room to room with a focused, desperate need to maintain close physical contact that the dog had never displayed before. Arndt went to bed at 10. At approximately 1 in the morning, he was woken by a sound from outside. He described the sound as someone walking on the dock. Not the dock of his property specifically, but the sound of weight on wooden boards over water, which has a distinctive resonance that he recognized immediately. He got up, took his service flashlight, which he still carried out of habit, and went to the back door. He opened it and shone the light onto the dock. There was no one there, but the boards at the end of the dock were wet. Not rain wet. The sky was clear that night, no precipitation. Wet as if something had come up out of the lake and stood on the end of the dock. There was also, he noticed, something on the dock itself. He walked out to examine it. It was a piece of fabric, dark, waterlogged, heavy with lake water, approximately the size of a shirt or a small jacket. He did not touch it. He went back inside, locked the back door, and sat up for the rest of the night. In the morning, he photographed the fabric and submitted it to the county sheriff's department, which he knew professionally. The fabric was analyzed. The results: dark wool, vintage construction consistent with clothing from the mid-20th century, heavily degraded by long-term submersion in fresh water. No DNA could be extracted due to the state of the material. The fabric appeared to have been in the water for a very long time before it came out of it. Here is the fact that I want you to hold on to. In 1951, a fisherman named Gust Varanen drowned in Morrill Pond during an ice fishing incident in early April. His body was recovered 9 days later. His ice fishing gear, his jacket, and his cap were never recovered. They presumably sank with him and remained in the lake. In 1951, the standard workwear in the up for outdoor labor in cold weather was heavy dark wool. No one has ever established a connection between Gust Varanen and the fabric found on Arndt Calloway's dock. The fabric is currently in a labeled evidence bag in a county facility. Arndt Calloway has not returned to Morrill Pond. He sold the family property 18 months after that weekend. Now, I want to offer a speculation, and I want to be very clear that this is only speculation. Some researchers who work at the intersection of hydrology and what they call anomalous event documentation have proposed the theory that deep, cold lakes, particularly those in geologically stable, low seismic regions, can act as what they call temporal preserves. Not in any mystical sense, but in the very literal sense that the extreme cold and pressure at depth can preserve organic material for extraordinary periods of time, and that under certain conditions involving changes in water temperature, pressure differentials, or lake floor disturbance from events like heavy rain or seasonal turnover, that material can migrate upward and eventually reach the surface. This would explain an object that appears to have been submerged for decades arriving on a dock in good condition. What it does not explain is how it got from the surface of the water to the end of the dock. What it does not explain is why it arrived at 1 in the morning. And what it absolutely does not explain is what was making the sound of walking on those boards. Ask yourself this. You have owned a place your whole life. You know it completely. And then one night, that place shows you something it has been keeping from you for decades. Something it has been holding at the bottom of the water. Something it waited until you were there alone, in November, in the dark, with no neighbors for miles, to show you. How much would you need to see before you understood that the place you thought you knew had never actually belonged to you? Because I think that might be the most genuinely terrifying idea in this entire story. Not the figure on the dock. Not the fabric. Not the dog's terror. The idea that familiarity is not the same as safety. That you can know a place for 47 years and still not know what it is capable of. That the places we love most, the places where we feel most at home, might have depths we cannot imagine and have never actually been invited to understand. Now we come to the fourth story, and this one is the one I want to talk about last because it is the one that I have spent the most time with, the one that I find least reducible to any comfortable explanation, and the one that I think will stay with you the longest. It comes from British Columbia, Canada, from a region of the province called the Cariboo-Chilcotin, which is in the interior, west of the Rockies and east of the Coast Mountains, a landscape of grassland, boreal forest, and hundreds of lakes ranging from small alpine ponds to vast stretches of cold blue water that look like something from the beginning of the world. The Cariboo is remote in a way that even people who know Canada often underestimate. The entire regional district has a population of roughly 60,000 people spread across an area larger than some countries. When people in the Cariboo talk about going somewhere remote, they mean something most people in the world have genuinely never experienced. In August of 2022, a group of 4 friends, all in their late 20s, rented a lake house on a private lake called Sable Lake, about 40 kilometers down a logging road from the nearest paved highway. The 4 people involved are Maren Kolb, who was 28 at the time and worked as a wilderness guide, Tavi Oosterhuis, 27, an outdoor photographer, Zéphirine Ardois, 29, a botanical researcher, and a man who has asked not to have his real name used, so in this account I will call him Caspian, who was 26 and was between jobs at the time and had come along because Maren had invited him and he had nothing else to do that week. 4 people. A private lake. A lake house with no internet and intermittent cell signal. A week in August. In the Cariboo-Chilcotin. On paper, a perfect trip. The house itself was an older structure, probably built in the late 1970s or early 1980s, solidly constructed from local timber, with a large main room, 2 bedrooms, a sleeping loft, a functional kitchen, and a screened porch that ran the full length of the lake-facing side of the building. The property had been in the same family for 3 generations and had only recently been listed for short-term rental. The handwritten welcome note from the owner included instructions for the water heater, instructions for the wood stove, and a single sentence at the bottom that none of them thought much about until later. It said, "Please do not go to the north shore of the lake. The ground is unstable and we cannot be held responsible for accidents." Maren, as a wilderness guide, read that as a caution about bog terrain or possibly a crumbling bank. Tavi wanted to photograph the north shore for the light it would catch in the early morning. Zéphirine had no opinion either way. Caspian asked what was on the north shore and nobody knew the answer. They agreed they would stay away from it, at least initially, and the first 2 days passed pleasantly enough. They kayaked, they cooked elaborate meals. Tavi took photographs that he later described as the best landscape work he had ever done, and Zéphirine found a species of wildflower at the lake's edge that she spent an entire afternoon documenting. The lake was extraordinary. Cold and clear to a depth that felt impossible, The kind of clarity where you could see 20 or 30 feet down and watch the way the light moved through the water in long shifting columns, pale and otherworldly, illuminating the lake floor in slow drifting patterns. On the third evening, Tavi went out alone at dusk to photograph the lake from a small rise on the east bank. He was gone for about 40 minutes. When he came back, something about him had changed in a way that was visible but difficult to describe. Marin later said he looked like someone had told him something that he was still deciding whether to believe. He sat down at the table and did not eat dinner. When they asked him what was wrong, he showed them his camera. He had taken approximately 60 photographs in that 40-minute period. Landscapes, the lake at dusk, the tree line, the mountain ridgeline behind it, the way the fading light turned the water from blue to violet to a deep, still black. Standard Tavi work. Beautiful. And then, in the 41st photograph, in the background of a wide shot of the lake's north shore, barely visible in the diminishing light, there was a structure that had not been mentioned in any listing, had not been visible from the house, and which none of them had noticed in their 2 days on the lake. It appeared to be a small building, possibly a cabin or a shed, standing in the trees at the north shore. In the 42nd photograph, taken perhaps 30 seconds later, the same angle, the same frame, the structure was not there. They went over the photographs for 2 hours. There was no misidentification possible, no trick of light and shadow that could account for a solid-looking structure appearing in one frame and disappearing in the next. Tavi had not moved his position between shots. The angle was virtually identical. Something had been there, and then it was not. Or something had not been there and briefly appeared to be. He could not determine which of those possibilities was less frightening. That night, Zephyrine woke up at an unspecified hour because of sounds from outside. She later described them as voices, low and indistinct, coming from the direction of the north shore, which was across the lake and therefore not close, which meant that for voices to have been audible from that distance, over water, they would have needed to have been very loud. She woke Marin. Marin confirmed she could hear something but could not identify it as voices specifically. They woke Tavi and Caspian. All 4 of them stood on the screen porch in the dark, listening, and they all agreed that they could hear something coming from the north shore, and that it was rhythmic, and that it rose and fell in patterns that suggested human vocalization, but that it was too distant and too distorted by distance and water to be clearly understood. They watched the north shore. After approximately 10 minutes, they saw a light. Small, yellowish, not the sharp white light of a modern flashlight, but something warmer, older. A light that moved slowly along the tree line of the north shore and then stopped. Stayed still for a moment. And then went out. No one slept that night. In the morning, they made a decision that, given what happened next, they would retrospectively question. Marin, because she was the wilderness guide and because she was genuinely the most experienced of the group in remote terrain, decided they should go to the north shore and investigate. She and Tavi crossed the lake by kayak while Zephyrine and Caspian stayed at the house. It took them about 12 minutes to cross. They landed on the north bank and pulled the kayaks up. What they found was not what they had expected, and I want to be precise about this because the details matter enormously. The north shore of Sable Lake was not unstable ground in any sense that Marin, with her professional expertise, could identify. It was solid, wooded, perfectly ordinary boreal forest. There was no bog, no crumbling bank, no geological feature that would justify the warning in the welcome note. What there was, in a small clearing approximately 30 meters from the bank, was a structure. Not a cabin. Not a shed. A structure that had been a cabin once, but was now something between a ruin and a skeleton. The logs of it collapsed inward on themselves, the roof long gone, the floor open to the sky, vegetation growing through and over it in a way that suggested it had been abandoned for at least several decades. Trees were growing through what had been the interior walls. The structure was old enough to have been claimed by the forest almost entirely. Inside the ruin, or rather in the space that had been the interior, they found things. Not the artifacts of recent occupation. older things. Rusted cans. A broken implement that might have been a tool of some kind. And in the corner, mostly buried under decades of leaf litter and forest debris, a wooden box, roughly the size of a small suitcase, its lid intact and held closed not by a latch but by a length of wire that had been wound around it many times, wound and rewound as if whoever had secured it had wanted to be very sure it stayed closed. They did not open it. I want you to understand that. They stood in front of it and they both knew. In that way you know things when your body understands something before your mind does, that opening it would be a mistake. Marin photographed it. Tavi photographed it. They took detailed pictures of the entire site. And then they went back to the kayaks and crossed back to the house. They told Zephyrin and Caspian what they had found. They spent the rest of the day trying to find cell service to contact the property owner and ask about the ruin and the warning about the North Shore. They could not reach them. They spent that night the same way they had spent the previous night, awake, listening, watching the North Shore. No light appeared. No sounds came. The lake was perfectly still and perfectly silent, and somehow all four of them agreed that was worse. Because the night before, whatever was on the North Shore had made itself known. And now it knew they had been there. And it had gone quiet. They left the following morning, a full 3 days before the end of their rental. Marin contacted the property owner by email once she was back in cell range and described what they had found. The owner's response came 4 days later and was 5 words long: "Please do not come back." That was the entire response. No explanation. No apology for the warning that had, in their view, been deliberately vague in a way that might have caused genuine harm. Just 5 words. Please do not come back. Marin attempted to contact them again several times over the following weeks. She never received another response. Here is where the research becomes genuinely strange. Tavi, as a photographer with professional research skills, spent several months after the trip investigating the history of Sable Lake and the surrounding area. He found records indicating that the region had been the site of a small mining operation in the early 20th century, roughly 1910 to 1925, that had failed and been abandoned. He found that the original property, the land on which the Lakehouse now sat, had been homesteaded in the late 1920s by a family whose surname he could not fully determine from the partially legible records he found, but which appeared to begin with the letter V. He found a reference in a regional historical archive to an incident in the 1930s at or near Sable Lake that was described only as an event of notable concern to the provincial authorities, that was investigated but resulted in no charges or findings. The archive reference provided no further detail. The original investigation documents, if they still existed, were not digitized and appeared to be in physical storage in a regional office that had not responded to his access request. He also found something else, and this is the detail that I find most haunting of all the details in this story. He found a photograph. It was in a collection of historical photographs from the Caribou region, digitized and made available online by a provincial historical society. The photograph was dated 1932 and showed what the caption identified as the Sable Lake Property, Caribou District. In the photograph, you could see the lake in the background, and in the foreground, a small cabin neatly constructed, with a porch surrounded by cleared land. Standing on the porch, looking at the camera, were 3 people. A man and a woman, both appearing to be in their 30s or 40s, and a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing between them. The photograph was in good condition for its age, clear and detailed. The cabin in the photograph was not the rental house they had stayed in. That structure was clearly from a later period. The cabin in the photograph was small and old-fashioned, with a style of construction consistent with the early 20th century. Tavi recognized it immediately. It was the ruin on the North Shore. He sent the photograph to Marin. Her response was a single question. She asked, "What happened to the people who were living there?" He could not find an answer. There is no record he could locate of what became of the family that lived in that cabin. The land was eventually purchased by the current owner's family in the late 1940s. What happened in the years between 1932, when the photograph was taken, and the late 1940s, when the land changed hands, is not documented in any record Tavi could find. The cabin was abandoned, presumably at some point in that 15-year window. And whatever the event of notable concern to the provincial authorities in the 1930s was, it remains officially unresolved. The box is still there, in the ruin, in the clearing on the north shore of Sable Lake, held closed with wire that someone wound many times around it to make sure it stayed that way. And I want to ask you the most difficult question of this entire story, the question I keep coming back to myself no matter how many times I think about it. When someone goes to that much effort to make sure something stays closed, when they wind wire around a box again and again, when they leave it in the ruins of a place they abandoned and never came back to, when they leave a note a generation later that simply says, "Please do not go to the North Shore," what are they protecting? Are they protecting the people who come to Sable Lake from whatever is in the box? Or are they protecting whatever is in the box from the people who come to Sable Lake? Because those are two very different things. And the answer to that question would tell you a great deal about what is in that box. And I am not sure either answer is a comfortable one. Let me bring all four of these stories together now, because I think there is something that connects them that is worth examining. Not the supernatural element, though that is certainly present in each of them. Not the isolation, though that is obviously a shared condition. The thing that connects all four of these stories, the thing that I keep returning to, is the way in which the places themselves seem to be active participants. The cabin at Harrow Lake and the figure in the trees. The lake house at Beaver Lake and the thing in the water that left a child's toy on a kitchen table. The family property at Morrill Pond and the fabric from the lake that appeared on the dock after 50 years. The ruin at Sable Lake and the light that went dark when it knew it had been found. In each case, the place is not simply a backdrop. The place is doing something. The place is communicating something. And in each case, the human beings involved reached a point at which they understood that the communication was happening and chose to leave rather than understand what was being said. Which raises the question that I think is the deepest one in all of this. What would happen if someone stayed? What would happen if instead of packing the car and leaving, instead of forfeiting the rental, instead of driving 9 hours back to Minneapolis at dawn, someone stayed and listened? Stayed and tried to understand? I am not saying anyone should. The people in these stories made the right decision to leave. I have no doubt about that. But the question of what the message was, what any of these places were actually trying to communicate, what they have been holding and carrying and waiting for someone to receive, that is a question that none of these stories answer. And I suspect, though I cannot prove this, that the answers are not the kind that leave the recipient unchanged. There is a growing field of study, still at the fringes of academic respectability but gaining traction, that examines what researchers call environmental trauma signatures. The core idea is that locations where significant human trauma has occurred, whether through death, loss, prolonged suffering, or sudden catastrophic events, may retain physical and energetic characteristics that can be measured and documented, and that these characteristics can influence the perception, mood, physiology, and behavior of people who enter those environments. Researchers at several universities in the United States and Europe are beginning to document cases where individuals with no prior knowledge of a location's history report consistent perceptual and emotional responses that correspond accurately to events that occurred in that location, sometimes decades or centuries earlier. This is not ghost research. This is not paranormal investigation. This is environmental psychology, and it is being published in peer-reviewed journals. It does not explain the figure at Harrow Lake or the thing in the water at Beaver Lake, not entirely. But it opens a door to a framework in which places are not passive, in which the ground remembers, in which the water holds on to things, in which a ruin in the Canadian forest might, in some measurable sense, be waiting. And I think about that a lot. I think about the way we use beautiful, remote, wild places, the way we drive to them and unpack our groceries and put on our swimsuits and tell ourselves that this is peace, that this is escape, that this is simple and clean and restorative. We forget, because we have the luxury of forgetting, that those places have histories that predate us. That the water was there before the dock was built over it. That the trees were there before the cabin was built among them. That the lake bottom was there before the reservoir was filled, and before that there were valleys and communities and cemeteries in those places that went about the serious business of human living and dying for generations before the engineers came with their maps and their permits and their decisions about what was worth preserving and what could simply be covered over. We go to these places and we think we are renting a house. And maybe, sometimes, we are renting something much older and much more complicated than a house. Maybe sometimes we are stepping into a conversation that has been going on without us for a very long time, and the other party in that conversation has a great deal to say. And maybe the question is not whether something is there. Maybe the question is whether we have the courage and the stillness and the genuine humility to hear it. Not to investigate it, not to document it, not to post it online or turn it into content, but to actually hear it. To understand that some silences contain more information than any sound we know how to make. I want to leave you with one final thought, and it is something that has stayed with me since I first started researching these stories. In every one of these 4 accounts, there came a moment when the person or people involved had a choice. Stay or go. Push further or pull back. Open the box or leave it wired shut. And in every case, they chose the version of safety that was available to them. They left. They packed their cars and they drove away and they went back to their lives and their apartments and their routines. And their lives continued, which is what you want, which is the right outcome. But none of them ever stopped thinking about it. Corvus Hale researched Harrow Lake for months after he left it. Theodora Vance still has the wooden toy in a box in her garage and has not thrown it away in 3 years. Arndt Calloway sold a family property that represented 4 decades of his life and did not explain his reasons to his own children for over a year. Tavia Osterhaus sent multiple unanswered requests for access to records that might explain what happened at Sable Lake in the 1930s. None of them moved on cleanly. None of them closed the door and left it closed. Because there is something in the human mind that cannot accept an unanswered question of that magnitude, something that keeps reaching back toward the thing it could not explain, like a tongue returning to the space left by a missing tooth. And that is what I want you to think about tonight, wherever you are, whatever you are looking at through your windows right now. Think about the places you love. Think about the places that feel like peace to you. Think about the still water and the dark trees and the sound of nothing that feels like everything. And ask yourself, with genuine seriousness, what do you actually know about those places? What happened there before you arrived? What is the ground underneath them holding that you have never thought to ask about? What is the water keeping? What is in the ruin you walked past and told yourself was just a ruin? And more importantly, if something in one of those places reached out to you in the night, if something knocked 3 times on your door or left something wet on your kitchen table or went quiet when it realized you had found it, would you stay long enough to understand what it was trying to tell you? Or would you do what every rational person does when the world stops making sense? Would you pack your car and drive back to the noise and the light and the comfortable density of other human beings and tell yourself it was probably nothing? Most of us would drive away. Most of us should. But these stories do not end at the point when the car leaves the driveway. They follow these people home. They live in the garage in a box. They live in an evidence bag in a county facility. They live in an unanswered email and an unresolved archive request. They live in the photographs that a wilderness guide and an outdoor photographer took on a lake in the Caribou Chilcotin in August of 2022. And they live, I suspect, in the places themselves, waiting with that patience that only very old things can manage. Waiting for the next car to pull down the driveway. Waiting for the next person to unpack their groceries and put on their swimsuit and tell themselves that the silence means peace. The water is always there. The trees are always there. And whatever those 4 places are keeping, Whatever they have been holding since before any of us were born, they are keeping it still. Patient and cold and deep as the lake bottom, waiting in the way that only the very old and the very certain know how to wait. Sleep well. And if you ever rent a remote lake house, if you ever find yourself pulling down a long logging road toward a property you have never seen in a landscape you do not know, do me one favor. Read the welcome note all the way to the end. Pay attention to the last sentence. And if it tells you not to go somewhere, if it uses a specific word like please, then for the love of everything that matters, honor that request. Because someone took the time to write it. And that someone had a reason. And the reason is very probably not the one you think.